airplanes. That's
Yeah. No, that's a podcast.
Yeah.
Loving
Well,
airplanes.
the real trick is find one that'll let you talk about airplanes, right?
Yeah, I didn't do that.
Yeah, I didn't do that either.
Yeah.
I also told myself I would never date an engineer though, and she got me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you got on that
I
one.
got yeah.
That's how I ended up talking about airplanes on the internet, is that my wife wouldn't let me.
Yeah, you need that
I was like,
outlet.
well, maybe somebody on the internet will listen.
Yeah.
Turns out many.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, welcome everyone. This is gonna be a fun one. We're gonna see if we can stir up some controversy, maybe get some arguments. Go off the rails a little bit here, but we'll go through, do some intros, and then we'll kick it off. So Dr. Chris Combs, do you want to give a little background on yourself and talk a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so I am a faculty member at the University of Texas at San Antonio. My background is in hypersonics and hypersonic aerodynamics. I built a Mach 7 wind tunnel down in San Antonio. There aren't very many at a U.S. university, so it's a fun capability that we have. Before I was there, I was at the University of Tennessee Space Institute right across the road from AADC, where they do a lot of hypersonic testing. I helped them build a wind tunnel there at the University of Tennessee, and I got my PhD at UT Austin doing Mach 5 wind tunnel testing. So been a bit of a hypersonics road, but kind of like we were talking about earlier, I got pulled into it a little bit too, because it's a hot field right now. It's no coincidence.
Literally.
That's what I'm doing, right? Yeah, it's pun intended.
Yeah.
So happy to be here and talk to you guys about it.
Sweet. Yeah, Alex Hollings.
Well, I'm a defense journalist. I started out working for a special operations specific outlet, and over time, I just sort of found my way into the aerospace field. Now I'm the editor-in-chief of Sandboxx News, which is an apolitical, military-specific outlet where we cover a lot of defense technology and foreign policy. And I've got a show on YouTube called Air Power with Alex Hollings, where I talk a lot about aerospace stuff. And this is actually the first public thing I've done since I was just nominated for Aerospace Reporter of the Year by the Aerospace Media
Congrats,
Awards.
man.
Bring that home.
Yeah, I'm famous this week.
There you go.
I'm a big deal this week. Yeah.
Because of this podcast.
Yeah,
You're on
no,
right now.
this,
Yeah.
That's why you guys booked me, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's it.
No, I mean, so we lovingly were like, how do we categorize these two? And it's like, since I found both of you on the internet, we're just calling you hypersonic influencers.
Yeah.
So
I'll take it. Yeah.
definitely underselling your backgrounds, but So Chris has some pretty spicy tweets that we might talk about a little bit later.
Sure.
And then Alex's background in terms of like going deep on a lot of defense tech and hypersonics is probably to the point where people are a little bit concerned about what you know and how you know it. But there's lots of good content from both of you guys out there. So it's gonna be a fun one. So cool. So I guess the audience knows AJ and me, but we don't need to go into that anymore. But just kicking it off.
Hasn't changed.
Yeah, it's still the same. Still doing what we're doing. So let's start talking about just what is hypersonics and really what is hype and what is reality. Like what is the state? A lot of people are talking about it. Hypersonic weapons, hypersonic systems. What is just hype and what is really like this is something to be paying attention to. So I guess we'll start with you, Chris.
Is it a noun or is it an adjective?
Ooh.
Oh, can it be both?
No.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so because you've got hypersonic that defines a regime of flight, right? And then you have, so I'm one of these people. I think hypersonics with an S on the end is a word as a field in and of itself. A lot of people don't like that. I stick to it.
Yeah, none of the hashtags with the S at the end work.
I know. No, so
because it's an adjective.
I'm a hypersonics believer, but the biggest misconception that we hear all the time, and we've all talked about this, is this idea that Mach 5 is when things become hypersonic, right? And it's in one of my favorite textbooks. Okay, I'm an academic. I'm going to jump right into textbooks, right? But the John Anderson hypersonics book, he says there's no flash of green light when you go from Mach 4.9 to 5.1. There's nothing magic that happens.
Really? Wait, I was waiting for that.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I know that you guys have designed, your aircraft to deal with that green flash, right? Like that's the real trick.
It's very Great Gatsby of him.
Because there's some really significant things that happen when you go, through that transonic regime and you cross Mach 1, right? But at the Mach 5 number, it's a nice round number that people agreed upon, and generally that's kind of when some things start to happen. But the bigger issue, which is not really defined purely by Mach number, is, okay, you start dealing with heating. You get into a regime where there's not necessarily a straightforward propulsion solution that's air breathing, especially. You're dealing with air chemistry. You've got this, a shock layer that forms around the vehicle, and you can start to see plasma. Those things pop up and become problematic at different Mach numbers depending on what condition that you're at. And like, I like to remind people, you could have Mach 8 in a really, upper atmosphere or low enthalpy wind tunnel environment that's much less harsh than Mach 4 right at the ground.
Yeah.
Right. So don't tell me Mach 5 is the only thing that matters.
Right. When we first started the company, we would talk to investors and they would do their like 0th order diligence where they, go up, basically Google something.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they would come back and start to say things about like problems that the shuttle faced. And it's like what are we doing here? It's like Mach 5 is very different than Mach, 25. Yeah, right. Exactly. And it's like, does it even classify as Mach 25 if you're that high in the atmosphere? It's like the distinction breaks down a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
And
it was
then
a
to
bit rarefied.
Yeah.
To make matters that much more complex, you have these genuine definitions for hypersonic, and there are a few of them depending on your application. But then you have the hypersonic class of weapons, which are a completely different category. When we're talking about hypersonic as a way to define speed, that's one thing. But a hypersonic weapon isn't defined strictly by speed. But there are lots of overlapping misinfo and disinfo, sometimes campaigns, genuine campaigns, aimed at sort of confusing that matter. So when we talk about a modern hypersonic weapon, we're talking about a weapon that can achieve these speeds and maneuver, right? So there's two classes of those. There's hypersonic cruise missiles that are honestly not all that different in concept from quarter horse. And then there are hypersonic glide vehicles, which are sort of an extension of ballistic missile technology. But then you have weapons like Kinzhal that Russia has in service. That's just a ballistic missile, an air-launched ballistic missile.
But marketing.
Marketing. So it achieves hypersonic speeds, and we can...
Which only works until they get shot down.
Exactly, until 6 of them do in one night now. But it really plays on... As soon as a word becomes a buzzword, especially within the defense enterprise, as soon as we start using them in press conferences and generals are being asked questions about hypersonic weapons being fielded by other nations, it's no longer just a question of what's the definition in the textbook. Now it's how is it perceived by the public, and what is the general understanding that people have? Because when they hear the word hypersonic, they're not going to think to Chris's textbook definition that's accurate. They're going to think to what they saw on Twitter last week. They're going to think to what they heard, Vladimir Putin say in 2018. So I think hypersonic is probably the most confusing word in aerospace, at least specifically in defense technology today.
And the thing that blows people's minds is because, and you're totally right, I think to the general public, to almost anyone you pull off the street and you ask them what hypersonic is, and they're pretty much just going to say fast. Really fast, right? And then you tell them a hypersonic cruise missile is slower than an ICBM.
Missile.
Right. And if they know what an ICBM is, their mind is going to be blown. Or if you explain it to them, and it's like, no, that's going to be coming in significantly faster than a hypersonic missile. And it's, oh wait, I thought hypersonic missiles were the newest, fastest.
We're the
thing.
fastest,
right? And that's not necessarily true.
Even when we're talking hypersonic glide vehicles, just because of the maneuvers, dependent on the maneuvers that they perform, they may reach a target slower than a ballistic missile.
There was a paper that came out from some economists, I think, that kind of reached out of their depth a couple of years ago, where they proved that hypersonic missiles were slower than ICBMs. Like it was this breakthrough discovery in physics, and it was like, guys, thanks.
Yeah. But then when you talk hypersonic aviation, which, I've made I haven't tried to hide at all the fact that I'm a Hermeus fanboy. I love what you guys are doing. Reusable hypersonic aviation is genuinely the future, whereas hypersonic weapons, single use case hypersonic systems, I think right now are very popular, and they certainly do have a few use cases, but they're not the future of aerospace, whereas reusable hypersonic platforms very much are.
Yeah, why do you think that is? Like, what to you makes that very obvious? Because it's like, we're very biased, obviously, and tend to agree with you. So, good work, and that's why you got, all those...
And that's how I got here.
All that free swag in the background. It's like a little quid pro quo. Good tagline for us, no, but yeah, so no, I guess, why did you come to that conclusion, or like, what about the space of possible capable weapons or systems makes you think that?
Well, when you're thinking about large-scale war, especially like a near-peer conflict in which you might want to leverage weapons like hypersonic weapons, the volume in which you can field these systems at becomes the determining factor of their value, right? You need to find a system that fills a capability gap or creates a new capability that you can leverage within your overarching strategy. But then if you can only afford to produce 6 of them, it's a novelty. It's not an actual added capability. There's no real strategic value other than the perception that your opponent might have. It might play into negotiations. But if you want to field a weapon system at scale, you need it in volume. And when you're producing single-use hypersonic platforms, like some of these hypersonic weapons that are in active development now, the DoD predicts some of them are going to cost $106 million a piece. That's more than a new F-35A, and that's a single-use weapon. You don't get it back.
And you need hundreds, right?
And you
really
need hundreds of
justify
them.
it, yeah.
A perfect example is, as any of you I'm sure can attest, there's no guarantee that any piece of technology will work the way it's supposed to every time. So if you really need to engage a target, you're not going to launch one hypersonic missile. Even if you know that it can defeat air defenses, you have to account for the possibility that it fails or that it's intercepted out of luck or that it just misses. So you're going to have to launch 3. Now we're talking about $300+ million for a single strike. That's just not feasible at scale because financial attrition becomes a question.
Yeah, so this is where cost per effect as the metric for how we decide what we invest in national security wise is so critical.
Absolutely.
And it's a really hard thing to actually get down into numbers and compare things apples to apples though.
It is. The one that I often use when it comes to hypersonic missiles is that a Tomahawk cruise missile costs between $2 and $3 million a piece, depending on the iteration of it that you're looking at. So if you have a target that's worth $106 million hypersonic missile, then it's worth 2 because you need to make sure that it hits. So now we're talking $212 million. So that same price, you can launch, 100 Tomahawks at that same target. And every air defense system, no matter how capable, has a saturation point in which it just can't defend against anymore.
Right.
So if you can reach that saturation point for quite a bit less money than a hypersonic weapon could defeat it, well, that's a great solution. But if instead you had a few hypersonic delivery vehicles where you could deliver lower cost munitions that we already have on the shelf, there's no R&D cost. The inventory issue isn't a big problem. Tomahawk cruise missiles, you need to bring a ship all the way back into port to resupply. We can't put missiles back into tubes out at sea. There's lots of logistical concerns. But if you have got a hypersonic delivery platform that can cover a great deal of distance, something that can fly like a strategic bomber, for instance, where it could operate out of Missouri if you needed it to. As expensive as that single platform may be, it gets cheaper with every flight. Whereas versus a single-use weapon where you're embedding a scramjet into the foundation of the bad guy's house. It's a waste of an exotic propulsion system.
Yeah, you're hired. Cool. So I guess within, the space of the technology and, where the developments are happening, Chris, where do you find the most interesting problems? Like, what are the things that really get you excited about this kind of like broad space of, hypersonics as a description or like a field?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of the things that get me most interested, one that I'll bring up first, because especially it's been so interesting to see Hermeus pushing on this, is on the propulsion end, right? And just how do you make this thing go at hypersonic speed for continued duration? Because a typical turbine engine isn't going to hold up. At even the SR-71, it starts to get close to Mach 3, and it's like you can't rely on just a turbine anymore, right? And how do we do something that's not just a rocket, right? That is actually going to help us fly at those speeds, and it's got the efficiency of an air breather. And so seeing that development with the turbo ramjet type configuration is really fascinating. That's a problem that gets me excited. And it's been great to see, these concepts that use existing hardware, so we're not entirely reinventing the wheel, actually bring these ideas out into, a physical, tangible thing, right? And then from my personal background, just this area of aerothermodynamics that is really interesting to me. And how do you manage the heating loads? How do you make these things fly? How do you take advantage of the shock structures that are there? How do you deal with the control problem where you start to try to turn and you have a flap or something that goes one way, and either you're so high up in the atmosphere that it doesn't really work, or you're low enough in the atmosphere, you get these big dynamic pressure loads and a shock wave in front of it that then does all kinds of nasty stuff. And then maybe you try and do a control jet instead, looking at like the X-15 type solution. But if you're in the wrong regime, then the control jet can give you negative effects and make you go in the opposite direction, right? So there's all kinds of fun stuff like that too that really gets me excited. I wanted to jump onto something, based on that last question about, what is it that I see about the reusable technology that's the future. And one thing I like to point out is just from my anecdotal experience, because I interact with a lot of students and I pitch to a lot of students. And I'm constantly trying to bring people into this area, right? We are kind of a workforce development hub. And there's a place for the defense work that's very important, and that's honestly where most of the money is. But talking about missiles isn't necessarily what gets a 16-year-old excited about coming into your lab. Talking about space planes and space shuttles and reusable commercial flight, where I can tell them, hey, maybe there's a scenario or a future world where you could fly across the country in an hour or 90 minutes or something like that, or get from San Antonio. You can get from San Antonio to anywhere in the continental U.S. in 20 minutes at Mach 7. And so that's teleportation type speed, right? Go and have dinner somewhere and then get home in time for bed, right? And so that's an exciting thing to think about, and people's eyes light up when they hear stuff like that.
How much smaller it makes the world.
Yeah, right? Exactly. I think one thing that we learned through COVID really is the value of being places, right? Because I think we hit this little window for a few years where we lied to ourselves and thought, oh, well, we've got, FaceTime and Zoom, and you can be anywhere, anytime, and like have this interaction experience. You can set up a Teams meeting or whatever, and you never have to go anywhere. You can work from home. And then we did that for a while, and everybody hates it. Yeah. Right? And
there was a time that I remember it was like I did quarantinis with friends. You
have
a few beers with your friends. You're like, you're vibing out. It's like, this is okay. It's not
Then
too
you
bad.
realize what you're doing.
Well, right.
Yeah.
And it's
you
like
have that like out of body experience.
Yeah. And then you shut it off, and then like you're in your apartment and it's silent.
And it's quiet and
I'm by
uncomfortable.
myself and drunk.
It's just kind of
I'm
a
just
bummer.
like, man, this is not the
It's
same.
like I'm playing
just
World
like,
of World.
I need to rethink my whole life now.
Yeah.
But,
Although as a journalist, it was great for me because I got to be on a bunch of TV shows that never would have flown me to film. But they would let me just hop on via Zoom.
And you even see it in, play out in the way that, okay, we're still in a world where you can remote work a lot of different places. And so there's plenty of opportunities to not necessarily live in the physical place that you work. And I think there was a point in time where that was starting to happen. And I thought to myself, well, wow, you could save a ton of money and like go live out in the boonies somewhere with a good internet connection. And then you don't have to like live in this expensive metro where they've got a lot of jobs and your job happens to be. And then, you're getting the best of both. And then you start to actually like see that play out. And what happens is everybody actually wants to live in the metro where the exciting stuff is or where their family is, because you want to be where the things are so that you can actually do stuff. And that kind of reinforces the value of actually going places, like being able to have that flexibility to be anywhere at any time and be close to the things that you want to do, which I think is what's part of so exciting about getting places fast and opening that door up.
Yeah, I think in terms of workforce development and getting people excited, for a long time, the only cool jobs in aerospace were really, at first, the satellite companies, like the new space satellite companies, and then followed up with like the rocket industry. But I think there's a lot of folks, I wasn't in this camp, but more so like the aviation and airplane focused folks, there wasn't really anywhere to go. There's starting to be, some of the electric vehicle companies and things like that where it's pretty cool to go look at. But, like a lot of almost everyone I know had a picture of an SR-71 poster in their room growing up.
Still do.
Yeah, exactly, right? And it's just like, I went down the space track when I went into aerospace, but I had that same poster, right?
Yeah.
There's something about the like high speed aircraft that is just this primal draw to like, this is objectively cool.
Yeah.
And so it's really exciting. It's like, that's the fun part about what we're doing.
It looks like the future, right?
Yeah.
And people, you can see somebody walking down the street every day wearing a NASA shirt. And whether or not they have any connection to NASA actually is probably unlikely most of the time, even though I like want to believe that they do. And
I always scoff. I'm like, I bet they didn't even work there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I've joked
Thanks,
before.
Target, for running the NASA line.
Yeah,
It's great.
I think I've joked before. It's hard for me to not go up to those people and say, "Hey, do you want to come and work in my lab?" kind of thing. Like, it seems like you might be interested in this stuff. But okay, NASA has this brand and it's cool, and people get excited about NASA work, and then you think, like you said, in the aero sector, who can be that? Is there something that can be that? Is there some aero related thing that becomes a shirt that people want to wear, even if they have nothing to do with what that is? And like, I think to bring people in, it's stuff like that it takes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we're on the cusp, it seems, of back in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, a little bit into the 90s even, we were going through this era of incredible new platforms seemingly rolling out at a pretty regular basis. These aircraft that we are still operating in large numbers today, military specific, the F-16, the F-15, the FA-18, these are all platforms that...
Thanks, John Boyd.
Right, yeah, the fighter mafia. These are all platforms that emerged in a previous era, but we've been iterating on the technology that, went into these aircraft all along, and they have been making iterative improvements, but it's not exciting. It's something that we've seen before. The
F-15, evolution, not revolution, right?
Yeah, the F-15EX is an incredible aircraft, but it is, it's a 1970s Dodge Charger with a new ECU. Now, all of these other different types of technologies, 3D printing like we saw today, all of these different types of technologies are coalescing into a new era where I think we're going to see a similar, few decade span of incredible new platforms like the Quarter Horse, incredible, NGAD with the U.S. Air Force, FAXX with the Navy, all of these new platforms that are just starting to take shape right now that are going to be the posters on the walls of a new generation of young people who want to get into aerospace.
Well, and you talk about some, you pick on a really important problem that the DoD is aware of, and that there was a time when development of a new aircraft system could take a matter of a few years, really, on the low end. And that used to be a thing that happened. But look at how long, the F-35 program has taken. Now it's like, if
compare that to the U-2.
And so it's 2023. If you were being realistic and you wanted to conceive a new, let's say, fighter jet program today, I think, are you being overly optimistic if you say it's ready to fly in 2045 or something like that? I mean, because that's kind of where we are right now. And
there's a mural in the Pentagon that exemplifies this exact point, where it's like to scale every aircraft that was made over the past like 60-ish years.
I know this mural, yeah.
So it's like, you have the Wright Flyer and then like nothing for a little while. Then like World War I comes in, you have all these cool things, and World War II. And then after World War II, there's this absolute explosion, massive density of all these airplanes that were built, some experimental, so many actually fielded. And then, take that through the Cold War. And then, come the 90s, that density drops massively to the point where it's like the F-35 sits there by itself with like nothing on either side. And you wonder, like, okay, why is that?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the peace dividend? Okay, probably to some extent. Is it the way that we develop complex systems today? Obviously, like, computing and modeling and simulation have come a very, very long way. And I think a lot of people think you don't have to build prototypes anymore to build really cool things. I think we would strongly disagree with that.
Yep.
So I think that's a big piece of it. But like, what are the next couple decades going to look like? I think, we believe that like you really have to integrate modeling and simulation, the tools that we have today, with the hardware richness of the 1950s. And that is where we go forward.
Mm. And the nice thing is that in this era, we don't have to put a person on board and risk a human life to start testing these vehicles, right? That's a further differentiator. So it's like, that is part of the reason I think it fell off a bit, was we didn't have the impetus or the drive to risk the human life that we did in the Cold War era, where we were scared.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
You'll
so
do some crazy things when you're worried about existential.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, how long did it take us to field the MQ-1? That went pretty quick.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
Yeah,
You know,
so-
the U-2, they invented the U-2 and Area 51 in like 18 months.
Yeah.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Well, going back to the iteration pace, I think, Chris, you were saying if you go back to I think it was maybe 70s, I can't remember exactly when this happened, but like Dassault would put out a new airplane every single year. Every single year.
Yeah.
When was the last time any aerospace company has done that?
Yeah.
So, I think this is a great conversation to go into, and this is a lot of the kind of focus of a lot of Chris's tweets. But, like, how do we develop? How do we actually do this, and how do we change it? So, actually, I'll start with Alex, and maybe just give a brief overview of how you kind of see the hypersonic space in terms of testing and development. Because I think you have the probably best holistic view of, like, the different programs that have been stood up and, like, through your research and talking about it. And so, kind of how do you see the development approach, and where do you see, like, the biggest holes? And then we'll get into maybe some of the other new space developments in terms of like how SpaceX is approaching things and things like that. So I'll kick it over to you.
Well, hypersonics as a whole are seeing a great deal of emphasis all around the world. We tend to talk about the hypersonic arms race in terms of missiles with Russia, China, and the United States. Though, as people are more and more realizing, Russia more or less is repackaging Cold War technology and with some real marketing. From what I've seen from unclassified intelligence reports, though, China really is a leader in the hypersonic glide vehicle space. Australia is doing some great work with scramjets, alongside with the United States. Japan has got, even North Korea has got claims for hypersonic programs that are underway. But within the United States, the big advantage the U.S. has is a big pile of money to spend. So while Russia has, Zircon, Avangard, and Kinzhal are their high-profile hypersonic platforms, China's got the DFZF, which is an anti-ship weapon. The U.S. has 70 different publicly disclosed hypersonic weapons programs in active development. Some of which are like Mayhem, the Air Force Research Labs program. That's not that far off from Quarter Horse. It's a similar premise. Then there are
DIU, when they put it out, actually used our photo on LinkedIn.
Did they really?
That was
Yeah.
different things.
Yeah.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, that was HiCat.
Oh, it was
Oh,
Hycat.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
the
yeah.
one. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So when you look at it that way, the United States is using a big pile of money to try a lot of different things. And then when something doesn't quite work, that's not a big deal because we've got 16 other things one step behind it, rating in the wings. We saw Arrow's, very high profile failure earlier this year. But something that's interesting to know about Arrow is that it had more successful test launches last year than Russia's Avangard has been tested at all. It was tested 3 times, 2 successful tests, 1 failed. Arrow had 3 successful tests last year, but the U.S. is looking to use hypersonics in a very different way than the U.S. isn't looking to field strategic deterrent weapons. The U.S. is looking to field strategic capabilities, which is a very different game. A deterrent weapon, a nuclear weapon, for instance, like Avangard, is a weapon you hope not to use. Its value is in the threat of its use, so you can put it into service when it's not even all that mature, because what you're really using this for is diplomatic leverage. The U.S. is looking to field, conventional forces, hypersonic platforms. They want to be able to use hypersonics to advance today's mission. And because of that, I think, even though you hear a lot about the U.S. being behind in the hypersonic arms race, I think that it's not really about who fields the first whatever, who fields the fastest whatever. It's about who fields the right one and one that fits within a larger strategic position. However, from what I understand, and Chris can speak to this better, testing infrastructure is a real limiting factor for the United States. And I think that's probably a great place for you to take over.
Yeah, and I would just jump off of what you said and kind of the thing about the conventional versus the potential nuclear threat, right? Is that the conventional problem, while this might seem counterintuitive to some, is actually, from an engineering standpoint, much more challenging because it's like, all right, how big of a spot size?
You have to be
are you
far
willing
more
to miss?
accurate.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, okay, a nuclear warhead, it's, get it in the right zip code and
Blast
and I
radius
think
will
we're
handle the
okay.
rest. Yeah.
But if there's something that that's a conventional system and you need to hit a really tiny target, that's an entirely different problem. That's an order of magnitude more difficult.
But if you're just looking for prestige,
Yeah, if like you said, if you want to take a ballistic missile and stamp hypersonic on the side of it, then great, good for you, and it got some points for a
Yeah,
few
you
years.
win the headline race.
And but yeah,
Some of
even
the new space launch companies are starting to do that as well.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Little plug there, but
Yeah. And so you know, they got some points in the media for a while. They got the U.S. to spend a lot of money on hypersonics probably by doing that, and now really even in the last week or so, it's starting to get exposed.
It reminds me of the MiG-25. You know,
Yeah.
the U.S. when the MiG-25 was sort of first revealed by U.S. intelligence circles, we thought it was this super fighter. We thought that it was, you know, based on the wingspan and wing area and the giant engines that it had, and the fact that, you know, a few times we saw it on radar breaking Mach 3. Little did we know it was at the cost of the engines themselves. But we thought that it was something terrifying. So we invested heavily into what became the F-15. We built something to compete against our imagined, you know, better, and ended up fielding, you know, the most capable fighter of the 20th century.
Yeah.
I think we're doing the same thing with hypersonics.
That's a great analog. And so to go back to the test thing, I mean, yeah, I think the entire world in a certain sense is held back by test infrastructure, right? And part of the problem is just physics and engineering, in that there's not a hypersonic facility in the world where you can do a full up hypersonic test at condition with an actual vehicle, right? That's just not a thing that can happen unless you're talking about a system that's, you know, kind of smallish in scale. I think a lot of people assume that there are wind tunnels out there where you could just build your hypersonic airplane and then just roll it into the wind tunnel and test it before you fly it. That's not a thing. The vast majority of the wind tunnels that are out there have 1 foot cross section or smaller. A lot of them are cold. And then you have these world-class facilities like at Air Force bases and at NASA centers that are several feet in scale, where maybe you could fit a missile shape in there, or like do an engine all-up test, but you're not doing some, you know, fighter jet-sized vehicle that you're testing in any of these. And then there's always the problem of, how do you actually get the temperature because of the way that you flipped the problem and now you're moving the air instead of moving through the air. So you're actually, that energy is being converted into the momentum of the air. And so then you got to heat it up, right?
Is it less expensive and faster to just try and build the plane?
Yeah, sometimes it is, because, okay, you start to look at the problem and it's like, you could build a, you know, maybe $100 million cutting edge wind tunnel facility that still doesn't do everything that you get out of flight. And then, or, you know, now you're like, depending on the type of program that we have, you could do some sort of flight test thing for that, especially if it's reusable, all right, depending on how you can instrument it.
That's the key, right? Is you have to break the development cost barrier.
Yeah.
Right? And so if you can field a system that can do that for under $100 million, perhaps, then you can break that, and then you don't have to go into the wind tunnels. And that's really the kind of core thesis here, is like, where do you spend your dollars and your time in terms of ground testing, and when do you push into flight?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the benefit of, you know, the speed regime that we're operating at, you know, RAM rather than Scram, is how we break up the testing and infrastructure of what we can actually get into.
Yeah.
And then also, you know, get into flight quickly and do it so in a way that is obviously safe, because there's no people on board, but, you know, it has a reasonable cost approach, and we just have to move fast, right?
Yeah.
And be able to build these systems at a price point that allows us to keep that under the $100 million to stand up a new facility, or wait in line 2 to 3 years at one that already exists.
Right.
And that's part of the brilliant pragmatism of your approach. Because, you know, we were talking earlier about missiles, air-to-air missiles. We've been fielding more advanced air-to-air missiles for many years now, but we're sticking them into the same AIM-120 or AIM-9 fuselages because that's what our aircraft are designed to use. But if you didn't have that limitation, if you could scrap that AIM-120 design and start from scratch building a new weapon that could do the same thing that the AIM-120 could do, but that wasn't designed 40 years ago, you can produce a weapon that does the same thing in a third the space for a third the cost. But we're stuck in the infrastructure that's in place.
Yeah.
And what you guys are doing is you're leveraging existing industrial infrastructure, existing products that are on the shelf, things like that, to produce something that can do something new. And if the same way now we could throw away that missile design and produce a new missile that's quite a bit cheaper that can do the same thing, or a missile that costs the same that can do that much more, we can do the same thing with aircraft, as long as we're not limited by those you know, dated infrastructure needs that right now a lot of aviation is.
Yeah.
It's something that in you know, plenty of interactions with DoD folks, I've pushed on for the longest time. Like NASA finally figured out how to do this properly with the Commercial Orbital Transportation System program, but like, don't specify what the vehicle needs to do. Specify the capability, number one. Number two, the interfaces.
Yeah.
That's it. You set things at that level, and then let the American innovation ecosystem go wild.
I mean, that's really what any kind of product development roadmap is, right? It's like set the requirements. Like, what does it need to do? And then let the innovation happen to give you what you want. And that's what, the commercial sector is good at, in terms of like websites and everything. It's like, well, if people want it, they don't care how Netflix streams stuff in the back end, right?
Yeah.
So it's like going back to that approach.
And I think that's what, we're having to innovate like that in the test space as well, because you have some like core facilities that are the name brand facilities for a reason that get backed up and stacked up, and then everybody's waiting years just to get their test in. You're starting to see some more creative stuff. Like NASA put out a call recently where they're going to start letting people do applications for sounding rocket tests. And so for get your hypersonic system on a sounding rocket, and then you can fly it down and do something at a pretty cheap, relatively speaking, flight test. We're starting to look at, the type of stuff that we have in our facility, right? The test is going to be flawed on the ground no matter what. Let's do something that you can run quick and cheap and learn something out of it before you go to flight, right? Or before you go to that more expensive test. And trying to understand as a community, what do you really have to have that full up test for? And what are the other things that you can figure out with other tools at your disposal? And like you said, a mix of the computational tools that we have now and understanding how to blend that in with the hardware, the flight test, the experimentation, and wind tunnel testing. It really, I think, because of the space that we're in right now with advances in computing and AI and machine learning and design of experiments and things like that, I don't think people really totally have quite figured out what's the perfect recipe of how much of each piece of that goes into the pie of development.
Right. And I think
we literally argue about this all the time.
Well, part of it is that it's hard to predefine it. It's hard to predefine, like a priori know what that approach is.
Yeah.
Right. And that is like lowercase a agile approach to things, right? Where it's like, you do have to find the balance, and it is program specific. It is vehicle specific. You're not going to be able to say it. And so I think to your point where it's like, there's a lot of, the portfolio of hypersonics might be broad, it's long lead time. It's very pre-prescribed. And I think that's what's like slowing down a lot of the innovation, is because, some of the time you have to learn your way through it to know what the right thing, what the right mountain to climb is. Right. And if you take a look from very far back and you set a program that is, 5 to 10 years out, well, what's going to happen is you're going to try and hit that timeline. And then when it's very long like that, it's exponential on how much you miss by, right? So it's like if you have very short timelines and very short development cycles, you may miss by 10, 20%, be a little bit late. But if we're talking about 5 to 10 year time cycles, you're 100%, 200%, 300% incorrect. And now it just goes crazy, right?
Yeah.
So interested to see, like in terms of like the full kind of end of the spectrum. And we were talking about this in the car about how, people say you're either a SpaceX fanboy or a SpaceX hater. I guess in terms of the approach there, though, of like Space Launch System, which is like, very long, or maybe even James Webb, let's say, where it is very pre-prescribed and very long, but it really worked. Like it worked, right?
Yeah.
And that's great. On the flip side, it's like more of the Starship approach, where it's just like ripping out vehicles and they're just, blowing up left and right. I guess, how do you guys see the kind of space there in terms of the optimal in terms of approach?
Yeah, I mean, and so I am, I like to joke. I think I have on my profile now iterative design and right? Like to hammer that point home, because I have people come to me like I don't have this concept of what iterative design is, but so it's interesting. NASA and SpaceX have very different factors pushing the way that they test and the way that they do things. And NASA is in a situation where they have a lot of pressure to get things right the first time.
Yeah.
And that causes them to, honestly, there were some things about when the SLS launch happened where I was almost like, wow, I'm surprised they're going for it right now. Because of the,
it's a very risk-averse culture.
Yeah, it is. And understandably, and when you have some of the things that have happened to them happen, that drives that point home. And also you have political pressure that makes things, because that is so high profile. If SLS had done what Starship did,
Yeah.
would SLS still be a program?
No, it's gone. It's gone.
I mean,
There's no chance. There's no chance.
and they know that.
Yeah.
And so it's like there's so much pressure to stick the landing so to speak, every single time. And
If SLS had done what Starship did, spending the same amount of time and money that Starship spent, would you have the same answer to the question?
Well, see, I think that's where narrative management comes into play. It's how you manage the narrative. It's not so much the performance.
It's the type of thing where it doesn't matter what someone like me thinks. It matters what, the senators from here and here and here think. And when because SpaceX doesn't necessarily have to answer to them, but NASA does. And so then if your funding is going to go away because it looks like you're incompetent, because there was some senator from whatever state that didn't like how it panned out, there's not a lot of margin for error. And so I think that's a big part of why they do things the way that they do.
What also makes it tough with that too is it's like the complexities of people systems.
Yeah.
So it's like when you have to keep the senators or the stakeholders happy, the way that typically manifests is through like, okay, what are the like KPIs? Like what is the metric that does it? And it's like, well, this is a human system. So you can't create structure around a human system to make them always behave the way. Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's the nuances of culture and complexity of those types of chaotic systems where it's like, but then it creates the structure, which slows things down, which increases the lead time.
And while I'm a big proponent of NASA, and I think NASA should be bigger than it is a massive organization.
Yep.
And massive organizations, there's inertia there, right? And you can't be nimble in the way, and SpaceX has gotten big, but they are nimble relative to what NASA can do. And so going onto that side, I mean, you have a CEO that pushes really, really hard and decides, okay, we're going to launch it this time. And honestly sets unreasonable expectations for when a launch is going to happen.
Specific days of the year matter.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah. And they say that that's not what it is, but that was quite a coincidence, right? That it happened,
wasn't it?
So it's like, what are we doing here? Come on.
Yeah, exactly. I have honestly been or felt like I was a pretty big fan of and a little envious of the way that SpaceX was able to test to a point, because there is an advantage, and compare even to Russia and the way that they can test. They have an advantage over US DoD programs and NASA in Russia, because if Putin wants that thing to fly, there's one person that you're really satisfying.
And tests aren't disclosed unless they're successful.
Yeah,
so there's
exactly.
No pressure.
So that takes away a lot of the pressure in the program, and benefits of authoritarianism, right?
Yeah. There are strategic benefits, even if they
title
don't
of the podcast.
Yeah, disclaimer, entirely tongue-in-cheek, right? But the, Aero got canceled, right?
Yep.
For not, and arguably maybe perform better than some of the Russia programs, but Aero got canceled because it wasn't enough. We talk about what happens with NASA. In Russia or in China, they wouldn't deal with that type of thing. And like you said, they can disclose the test when they're happy with it. SpaceX, credit to them, they make it very public.
I think that is something important though, is like we talk about it here too, is like, what we're doing is very, obviously ambitious and like very difficult. So it's like constantly the conversations we need to be having is like, how do we reduce the stakes?
Yeah.
How do we make things robust to failures or, different decisions or like uncertainty or everything like that. And so I guess the question is there a world though, in hypersonics, especially like ones that are DoD driven, a way to reduce the stakes? Or is it just inherent to the life cycle and the lead times where the only way is because you have to invest so much money and invest so much time, you have to put all the structure around it that makes it inherent to the situation?
Well, it's like Alex was saying, I think a bit of it is in diversification, right? And the fact that you have so many programs, it's not quite a big blow if one of them doesn't quite pan out or doesn't perform as well as you want. I do think it's a great idea to not just diversify the programs, but diversify the performers. As much as you can. And like you said, if you get to a point, right. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but like if you have one prime that wins every single contract, even though it's 70 different programs or whatever, like you still kind of have one program in a sense. And so I do, and it's I think we're doing an okay job of that. I mean, because you've got different things. They're spread out across different agencies, for better or worse. They're spread out across different performers to a certain extent. I think we can always make room for more entrants and more different things, but we're kind of starting to work that direction. And then you also see, pushing into, like I said, sounding rocket testing, or, doing testing more in academic wind tunnels and figuring out what types of things you can do at lower cost and at lower scale and still get value out of that. I think all those types of things help drive down risk, and you start working in different ways that help you move faster, right? I talk about SpaceX. I really hope that the things that they send up, we can find ways to leverage that and get test data out of it, because it's a flight regime that is expensive and you don't get very much very often. And you've got a company that's sending, thousands of satellites up all the time. What would it take to get, some thermocouples on some of those or something like that? Just start to build up a database. I think that could be
that's what
interesting as well.
That's what VARDA's for.
Yeah, right.
But I do think, though, that the nuts and bolts of the actual performance of a platform or a program is only half of it. Like we were saying a minute ago, managing the narrative around it is how you political proof a program. So as long as you manage expectations, the F-35 is a good example because it was a broken acquisition process that resulted in a very capable platform. But perceptions of the F-35 are still that it's a failed effort, or at least for a lot of people out there.
Even Concorde. We constantly get asked, what about, why are you guys going to be successful when Concorde failed? It's like, what?
Well,
Yeah.
pretty sure it flew
Did
for
it
30
fail?
years and was the safest aircraft of its time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But so when
Iteration one.
when you manage the narrative properly, and which is one thing to Elon Musk's credit, he said a few days before, Starship will probably explode, but as long as it gets off the launch pad, that's a good thing. That was, maybe in part just Elon Musk being himself.
I think that worked for like 24 hours though.
Yeah,
Before people saw
agreed.
through it. Yeah.
But especially when you're the United States, because the U.S. is perceived as the technology leader in a lot of these fields. And so as a result, when something doesn't perform well right off the bat, it's colored as a failure. Not just because there are, people out there who've got a negative opinion of the United States, but also you shouldn't discount the fact that there are national government-led information operations meant to, take the knees out from under efforts like these. The whole idea being that, we need to frame, for Russia as a great example, it's not just about keeping a seat at the table for diplomacy, but it's also about they're so reliant on foreign weapons sales that they have to convey this image of being a legitimate competitor with the United States, so they have to say Kinzel can do all these things because they need someone to buy it so they can build the Su-57, so they can build the T-14 Armada. Because the United States isn't reliant on these things, we expect the U.S. to do well. We expect SLS to work.
Yeah.
And as a result, the stakes are significantly higher, in part because we don't do a very good job of managing the narrative surrounding these iterative design concepts. People want the B-21 Raider to be unveiled and then take off and enter service, And
that'd be sweet.
and if one of those B-21s ends up crashing, we're going to call that a failure in this current media climate, even though we crashed so many F-16s in testing, we used to call it the lawn dart.
Oh, the first flight of the S-16
was an accident.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yep.
The
High-speed
first-
taxi is a flight test, everybody. It's a flight test.
But at the time, the media environment was different. There was certainly some coverage painting the F-16 as a problematic program, but it wasn't a failure. The F-35, on the other hand, has had far fewer issues, much more money, but people consider it a failure because of the shift in how we perceive these exquisite technological programs. And
This is one area where I think leveraging public-private partnerships around national security issues is so incredibly powerful, because when you're coming from the venture-backed startup world, when like TechCrunch is paying attention to you, not just Politico, the narrative that you can drive is exactly that of like, look, learning is what is important here.
Right.
It is like, that is how we define success. We do not define success. We don't like scale people's bonuses based on the number of successful tests that they achieve. There are primes that do that. And it's bad.
It creates kind of like programmatic safety and even psychological safety for your employees to be high performers. Right?
That's right.
Well, this is the Russian
Yeah.
military. You
Yeah.
don't want to present bad news because it'll hurt your career.
Right.
So,
It's like, no, we need the bad news so we can learn about it and fix it now. And we need it now.
Yeah. Like, I mean, like we've kind of like tried to define commander's intent within the company of like, how do we push decision making to the edge so people can make good, high quality decisions very quickly?
And-
And one of those things is, basically exactly this.
Yeah, like drive.
Push corporate learning to the left.
Yeah,
Exactly.
And that's the thing. And you said good, high quality decisions, and that's kind of where I draw the line. Is you want to
You want bad.
I
you want
don't.
bad
I don't
decisions.
like good, high quality decisions.
Yeah, right. And so
How do you feel about flame trenches?
well, yeah. So that's kind of the thing. That's kind of why I said, there's a point to where the sort of iterative test makes sense, and it's you don't want to get reckless.
Did
right?
SpaceX jump the shark on that
I
one?
think that they kind of did. That's just, and that's the disappointing thing. That's what it feels like. I know they've got a ton of smart people there. It felt like that one got pushed and it got rushed. And if SLS had blown up on the pad because they didn't do what they needed to do in a wet dress or something, I would have said the same thing, right?
And I feel the same way about Aero. I think Aero was rushed, and that resulted in poor performance.
Yeah, and so you have to. Of course, we all want to fly the thing. We all want to see, the test, but don't test when you're not ready to test, and don't test if it's not done. And if your thing is too complicated to get done on the timeline that you need to do the test, then you should have had a simpler design, right? You should have done something that was lower risk, that wasn't so complex, that wasn't totally reinventing the wheel, that didn't have like 10 new things that you'd never done before, right? And so there's like, you can test things piecemeal. You can test things in different pieces. You can test like, okay, this subcomponent, or this thing at scale as you work your way up to that competence. But if you put yourself in a box where you have to test the revolutionary thing that's like already really low TRL, and you've got to make these crazy leaps and bounds that borderline touch up against what's physically possible, like, yeah, you're putting yourself in a position where you might end up not feeling truly ready to have a quality test for way longer than what you're willing to accept. And that's, I think, when you end up in a situation like this, because one of the things I see with Starship, there are some really, really complicated problems that they have boxed themselves into with that design. I think it's a really cool and exciting design, but there are some problems that are hard to solve. Like for anybody, it doesn't matter who you are. There's some really difficult engineering challenges with that spaceship. And it's not going to be something that you can just rush by sheer force of will and just decide, well, we're going to test it again and then it'll work. Like there's only so much you can learn from test at a certain point.
So here's a theory. So one of the things that we kind of always really push for here is getting to integrated systems quickly and testing them, which is very much in that regard. The key though is like it's not just the hardware, it's the people.
Yeah.
So like, what's the point of this Starship test? Actually flying Starship?
No.
Or is it exercising
The life cycle.
the life cycle and getting the FAA to approve flying Starship in the first place?
It depends on what the objective is, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
if there's clarity, so I
Like,
think
am
to that
I
point-
willing to spend 3 months rebuilding my concrete pad to get the FAA to move faster for the next thing?
yeah.
Well, but maybe if that was the case, it kind of backfired because the FTS didn't work properly.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Oh,
See, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
If you I'm not saying that they cut a corner. I don't know what happened, but if you aren't 100% ready to do the test, then you risk because that's
Not knowing which variable.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because it was and people the thing that I hear the most is but Falcon 9. But Falcon 9, how could you doubt them with Falcon 9? Falcon 9 is an incredible system. It was not that was a much more technologically mature leap to get to Falcon 9 than what they're trying to do with Starship.
I mean, heck,
And
Merlin had flown.
yeah. And so
Right.
and you're talking about a rocket that could get things into Leo, right? And like, not to take anything away from that, but that was a technology that had been around for quite a while.
it
okay?
had been solved by someone.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
And so and then the whole thing with the landing, right, which is probably the most novel thing about Falcon 9 is the reusable boosters and being able to land them out on a pad and then out on a barge eventually. It was fine if they just like plastered all these pads with blown up Falcon rockets.
Yeah, their
because-
customers paid for every single one of those flight tests.
The mission,
Fantastic.
yeah, exactly. They were paid for. The mission was a success before that part of that stage of flight even happened. So it's like, who cares if it never works, right? They were still making pretty cheap rockets that like had a cost model that was probably going to work for them, and they got it figured out after enough flights and perfect. That
And the
was
narrative
awesome.
game was really good there. 'Cause
Yeah.
when you talk about hypersonic flight, you could have a technology demonstrator that flies, let's say, under scramjet propulsion for 4 minutes, which would be a great story, right?
Yeah.
If it explodes at the end of that 4 minutes, the story is either we had a scramjet operate for 4 minutes, or our technology demonstrator exploded. And perception leading up to the test is what dictates that headline.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, we've tried to be pretty forward. Like, we're gonna make some holes in the desert along the way here.
And you should.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think that's
And the other thing, though, I think, like, we're going to do some things, and we're probably going to do some things publicly that people will look at and say, they should know that. They should know they shouldn't have to test that. They should know that. But, like, we're trying to be very intentional about how we're approaching risk. And
I think that's the difference, right? There's a very different thing from being aggressive with risk, or it's not even aggressive with risk. It's like being very aggressive with consequence, especially mission level consequence.
That's an important word, is consequence.
Right, it's consequence because it's how we think about likelihood, and it's like, what is the actual impact? That's very different than negligence, right?
Right.
It's like we're just blind, like, well, I don't know, fuck it. Like that's a very different thing, right?
Yeah.
So I think if it was like, okay, we are going to test this, Starship, knowing that, hey, the flame trench probably isn't going to work, but we're unlocking learning for this other team that is more important. Great. If it was like, oh, well, I'm on this tight deadline and I didn't do all the work, that's bad, right?
Yeah,
It's
right.
like there are certain things that you can descope. You can't descope the work.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like you can descope complexity. You can descope requirements. You can't descope like doing the right analysis, or like you can't descope manufacturing, right? It's like
Right.
that's just part of the work.
Right.
well, digital engineering would beg to differ.
Oh, well,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if we have enough time.
Yeah, that's a whole other hour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But genuinely, when you're looking across, all, not just aerospace, but all technology in general, failure is what breeds success, right? You need to screw up to do things right. Because, I say this all the time when we're talking, we've talked a lot about, foreign weapon systems, but Russia and China in particular, with their method of disclosure with testing, it either means they're not testing the way they should, or they're not disclosing tests. Because if you don't fail, it means you never found the outside limits of the system that you're working with. And you need to know where those outside limits are to know where to make iterative improvements, to know what may happen if you find yourself in unforeseen circumstances. You need to fail to know where the failure point is.
Right. I think that's the key thing, where it's like, the Silicon Valley line of like, fail fast. It's like you're not seeking out failure. You're just being honest with yourselves that when you're doing something hard, you will fail. Like, it's going to happen. Like, don't be too naive to think that you won't fail. So then the key is like, okay, we are definitely going to fail. So let's make it happen as soon as possible.
Yeah.
That failure
Let's
that will
find that
always
point.
exist, bring it in.
And I think that's the thing, is that when you're doing any kind of reasonable risk assessment, is accepting that failure is not a binary thing, and not all failure
Great
is
point.
equal.
Right.
You're doing a proper risk assessment, and you're thinking, okay, if this thing happens, what is the worst consequence that comes out of that?
Right.
And then you've got to go through all the worst case scenarios and decide which ones you can live with. And if there are worst case scenarios in your table that are gonna, nuke your test site, right? Or make it so that the
Right.
FAA is never going to want to work with you again, then you say, okay, we need to de-risk that.
That's right.
Because that's a problem. And I think that was part of what was so eye-opening about the Starship thing, is people say, oh, well, they worked with the FAA, and they said they even included it blows up on the launch pad as part of their risk assessment, and they said that was fine, right? And it's like, well, this seems way worse. And so did you miss it? Or like, did you not think about this happening?
Yeah,
And-
tiles have just started washing up
Right. Yeah.
weeks later.
I think I have to go down there next month and see what I can find.
Yeah, right?
It's,
Yeah,
it's like a
that'd
I
be
think
4 hour
if you
drive
gather
for
enough,
me.
you can probably make a nice like kitchen countertop.
Yeah. That's
No,
what
that
I'm
would
going
be a
for.
pretty good
I'm
counter.
sure
Yeah.
my wife would go nuts for a Starship tile countertop. I'm sure. Yeah.
Coaster.
Yeah. Right.
I know some people online that would pay a lot.
Yeah.
They comment under every one of my videos.
Yeah. Well, no, they're on eBay now. I think for like $500, you can get a pretty big piece.
I can't tell you how often, I'll do a video about some complex new defense technology program, and then it fails. Arrow being a great example. And then the constant comment is, have Elon Musk do it. It'll work then.
Yeah. Well, hey, that's good. That's good marketing on his point. It's
Again,
like, we gotta
it's
get there.
managing
Right.
narratives.
Yeah.
Yeah. The narratives do not, perception is not based in reality.
Yeah.
Perception
But
is
it,
reality.
but it creates reality. Yeah,
Exactly. You know what I mean? I wrote a book a few years ago called Perception Management and How Narrative Informs Warfare. And it really is true that it's not really about your capability. It's about your perceived capability when it comes to geopolitics and diplomacy. but it's also
venture
about that when
capital.
it comes to funding. Your perceived credibility and capability is what dictates how much money people are willing to hand you. And that has more to do often with how good you are at messaging than it does with how good you are at actually executing. You know, and
A la Theranos.
we've seen it
Right.
time and time again where, big name companies become very prominent and then fail spectacularly because they specialized in the messaging, not the execution.
I mean, that's in every walk of life. That's in academia too. There's, there's labs that operate that way also, where it's, there's somebody with a big name and, they get the contract, they get the work, and that's not specific to hypersonics.
I suppose
or anything,
journalism
but-
too.
I mean, it's every field has that, right?
Yeah, the success begets more success, and eventually people are just pattern matching to past performance.
Exactly.
But
Right.
once you get to super credibility,
Then you're in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, especially when we're talking about, big dollar efforts, it really is. It's all credibility when you walk in. Arrow is a great example, as a program that was on fast forward. I mean, the idea of fielding any kind of air-launched weapon system that quickly from scratch, that would be a very quick timeline. So the idea that we expected Lockheed to produce a hypersonic glide vehicle on that timeline has everything to do with just the fact that Lockheed's a giant conglomerate with $1 jillion to spend. And we go, oh, well, there's no problem you can't spend with enough money, thrown onto it. But sometimes there is. But but again, the perception, though, was that if anybody can do it, it'll be them.
And one of the interesting things about, Arrow and some of the struggles that it had, which a lot of them had nothing to do with the hypersonics.
Yeah, they were all failed, like
captive release type
stuff that we
things,
should have had
or-
locked down 40 years ago.
The rocket didn't ignite, or all kinds of stuff like that. But it
That's,
was
the interfaces
that's the
between
basis for my
systems.
rush argument.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, and we take that for granted so often, but it's so important.
And that's really what makes me think they were rushing. Is that the failures were on igniting the motor.
Because purely from an engineering standpoint, the hypersonics, physics problems that we deal with, these scramjet powered air breathing things are more complex systems than a boost glide, which is a
maneuverable warhead.
Yeah, it's an arrowhead, right? That's
Yeah.
where the name came from. It's an arrowhead that you put up to the edge of space, and then it can glide back down. So you don't even have an engine on that thing.
Yeah.
Once it separates. But that program did struggle, and then we've seen it really impressively. Some of the scramjet powered stuff do really well.
We saw a
honestly, better than I
Lockheed
thought
and a
it would.
Raytheon scramjet.
Yeah.
Both passing tests.
Right.
For Hawk.
And again, it's like Lockheed. Their scramjet was doing better than their
boost glide
system,
vehicle.
which
Yeah,
should have been the easier one to get functioning.
And that does speak to what we were talking about before with what you guys are doing with a ramjet. Why I think that makes so much sense. It's this idea of, let's take these technologies that we know work separately. Let's put them together and create a new capability without reinventing the wheel and burning a mountain of money.
I think the other key there is, and this is what AJ was kind of alluding to, but it's like we also have to own the interfaces within a single company, in a single structure, right? It's like that's where all those failures were happening, right? It was like at the interfaces of mega conglomerates, because one, it's hard to test those interfaces because you're operating within you define your ICD, but then you don't ever test it across. I think we saw the same thing with Starliner, right? When the Starliner failure, it was like a timing issue because those systems hadn't really been tested together. They met their ICDs or with their perceived ICDs, but communication breakdown. The other thing with these systems is like as you're pushing further and farther into the envelope, you can't decouple systems as easy, right? The ability to access the performance limits of different systems is only because you can easily trade across those interfaces. It's like, for our bypass system, how big that is relative to the size of the vehicle. Like, where we place the tanks changes our center of gravity, which changes how our landing gear is, which changes how big our elevators have to be. And like everything is super coupled. There's no way to really separate it unless you just solve it all kind of simultaneously.
And I think we keep learning the hard way, really, that you can't silo these design elements.
That's right.
Right? I mean, I think there's an old joke with, it's kind of a montage of images, and it's like an aircraft designed by the propulsion team. And then it's just like 3 big engines, right? And then it's like the aircraft designed by the controls people, and it's like a bunch of big flaps and like nothing else. And then it's like the people that are designing for the people and the interior, and it's this giant, it looks like a school bus, right, with like little bitty wings on the side. But
isn't there one where it's like designed by finance, there is no airplane?
Yeah, right.
There's no airplane.
And so you have to have people that can cross those boundaries and work multidisciplinary and see the whole picture, which is rare.
This is why I write about it, because I'm not
Yeah.
capable of that.
Well,
but I can just write about when you guys do.
This is honestly the hardest thing about this problem. It's not the physics. Yeah, it's the business, but it's not really the business. It's the people. The workforce to go after these problems doesn't exist. You have the disciplinary expertise and the, I'll say, engineering culture that's required to do this are in very different places. It's like, and there's a part of a reason for that. It's like it's really hard to get those things together in an academic setting, in a university setting, being undergrad, graduate, PhD. I mean, you're lucky if you're able to get like, you know, 1 or 2 hypersonic ground tests in the course of a 5-year PhD program. With rockets, like, I mean, people are building rockets.
We do 4 or 5 a day.
Yeah, not at Chris's
Nice.
lab. Yeah.
Yeah.
But like rockets, there are competitive engineering clubs, competing with each other across the country and across the world, building rockets.
You've got guys who don't believe the Earth. Well, not anymore. He's passed away now. But who don't believe the Earth is round, making rockets.
Well, he's not making a ramjet. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, that's
right?
for sure. Yeah.
So I think that's something that I think really handicaps this part of the industry. It's really hard to get that combination of kind of the theoretical experience that you need alongside the practical hands-on experience that you need.
And it's something as a country really we're trying to address and to fix, but it takes a while, and there is a lot of inertia and momentum to overcome with that. And because one of the problems with hypersonics has been the cyclical nature of the interest in the funding, and right now we're in a peak.
The old 17-year itch.
Yeah, exactly. And so we have all these people that worked on, say, the shuttle program, or and that are maybe reaching retirement age or on their way out, or are already out. And we've lost a lot of expertise that we used to have, or we've just flat out forgotten how to do a lot of things, which I think was part of the growing pains with Aero too, is just, you talk about muscle memory as a larger organization, and you don't do a thing for a long time. And then there's these little details that you lose. I've even heard with some of these big tests and some of these big organizations, it's like, oh, why did the test slip by 2 weeks? And oh, we needed to retouch the paint, but there's this one guy that does it right, and he was fishing that week. So, it's like you have all these individual linkages of very narrow expertise that we haven't been able to duplicate, that you're super reliant on, and that's a tough way to operate, right?
It's very
and so
fragile.
Rebuilding that capability is something that we're working on, but it doesn't happen overnight. A PhD takes 5 years, right? And so, by the time that somebody shows up at my doorstep at a university, right, even as a freshman, a lot of them have their mind made up about what they're going to do, or it's already started to narrow. Minds start changing in, middle school and high school. I mean, you could probably go around here at Hermeus and ask people, when did you realize you wanted to do aerospace?
Yep.
They weren't deciding junior year of college, right? They knew what they were doing by then.
No, I was. But
I'm still not sure what I'm going to be when I grow up.
You're talking about, like, we start addressing this problem today, and you see the payoff 10, 15 years from now when those people are really impacting the workforce. And so we're going to have to be patient with it.
Yeah, I think this is another area where an iterative approach to development really allows you to speed up the OODA loop, to use another John Boyd reference.
Yeah.
When in the span of, like, let alone a career, but like within the span of a graduate degree, you can go through multiple vehicle development cycles, like full soup to nuts, from design, analysis, manufacturing, integration, test. As the scope and the stakes growing each time. That is a massive workforce development tool.
Yeah. Yeah. And we do need to be taking advantage of that, right? Because we've got a lot of really smart, talented, capable people. This is one of the things I've said about hypersonics, because the workforce problem is a problem that can be solved. If people want to invest in it, if you want to put the money into getting these students through the pipeline, working on the projects that as a nation are important, it's there. It's an easy problem to solve. It's about the dollars, right? And like, put the investment there, and people are going to come to that,
right?
Because like I said, even sometimes missiles isn't the obvious sell, but you start talking about things that fly fast, and space, and planes, and rockets.
And everyone got into aerospace to make stuff.
Yeah,
We're here
right.
to make stuff.
This is an
And
easy
fly.
place. These are easy roles to recruit into. because it's cool.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's
And with companies like
indisputably
Hermeus
cool.
forming, it makes it
Yeah.
that much easier to recruit people into the field. Because
Yeah.
now it's not just there are 4 potential, end points for this career.
Yeah.
And only so many jobs within those 4 companies. you
Right.
know? But now there are companies like Hermeus that are popping up, and people go, "Oh, it's a small company." I was making a joke earlier that might have been in a bit bad taste, but the mean
Let's go.
age in this building is dramatically lower than the mean age in the GE aerospace facility that I toured not too long ago. There are young people are interested in what you're doing, and that will spur more young people to be interested in what you're doing. And it may eventually even result in competition for Hermeus, which nationally speaking would be a good thing. I know you guys may not love it, but
Well, okay, I would
as a-
challenge that. Honestly, it's kind of hard sometimes when we don't have direct competition because we have to push ourselves.
Yeah,
It's-
that's
People
fair.
ask us who do you compete with? Well, the answer is China.
Yeah.
And that's a very amorphous kind of not tangible
Yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah.
Because anything that could actually drive a team to work faster to a milestone, it's all classified anyway.
Yep.
So that's not super helpful. So really, it's we're competing against ourselves. So I don't.
so
mind
maybe
other
that
people
competition
going
good
after it.
mind. Yeah.
Go for it.
And,
And also, good
it's
luck.
and-
But
Yeah,
let's go.
but it's
Also-
awesome to know that there's a 12th grader right now
Yeah.
with a Halcyon poster on their wall who's going to try to form a company to compete with you.
Yeah.
in
And that
10
person
years.
is you because you have the
And I have a Halcyon poster on my wall. Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I'm an objective journalist right up until I got here.
Yeah.
Right, fair.
No, but the reason why I really like what it is that you guys are doing is because I get accused sometimes in my work covering defense technology of being a warmonger. I'm a Marine veteran. The last thing that I want is war. I don't want my friends who are still in to be put in harm's way. And the last thing I definitely want is for there to be a conflict on the horizon that arrives just in time for it to be my daughter's problem. And I am a firm believer in the deterrent power of technology. The heroism of engineering we were talking about earlier at lunch. In our country, in our culture, we place a huge emphasis on wartime heroism, and I do buy that. But I think that we increasingly in the United States need to understand and appreciate that engineering heroism that happens 4 years earlier at a drawing table that could prevent that conflict from happening in the first place. The F-22 Raptor, I see people all the time calling it a failure because it never shot any airplanes down. It shot down a few balloons now. That is an immense success. The point of spending $180 million per Raptor is to produce a platform that other countries have to think twice about. You go, all right, so if we square off with the United States, we're going to have to contend with this, and this. Is that worth it?
Oh, and this.
Exactly,
This,
and
Right.
that.
And that deterrent value is incredible, and the United States has the advantage of, I joke all the time, brilliant engineering is not specific to the United States, right? But funding for that engineering often is, right? The Soviet Union didn't lose the space race because they ran out of ideas. They lost the space race because of
Their economy is the size of Texas.
exactly.
Texas's economy.
Exactly. You can solve problems as long as you're willing to invest in them. And as a country, if we can learn to appreciate the heroism that can be found there, right there on a sheet of paper, that can solve a problem, that can produce a system, that can make a country, a bad actor from our perspective, geopolitically, right? Objectively speaking, everybody's looking out for their own best interest. If it's in your own self-interest not to fight that fight, we all win.
Yeah.
Well, and
This is why I got in trouble for suggesting that defense contractors make whatever profits they want in peacetime and no profits in wartime.
Huh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I got in trouble for that.
Yeah.
well, and it's how many lives did Patriots save in the last several
Exactly,
days?
right?
And the ability to shoot down ballistic missiles, that's novel. And you look at the hypersonics problem, for example. If you want to shoot down something that's hypersonic, you need to understand the hypersonics problem. You probably have a hypersonic delivery platform also to go and catch that thing. So I think people kind of gloss over that, and sometimes the outsider perspective is purely focused on an offensive standpoint.
Yeah.
But it's a Department of Defense, and it's called that for a reason, right? And
Yeah.
it is, a lot of it is deterrent, a lot of it is a protection aspect for the realization that there are, believe it or not, bad people out there. It's not all fairies and rainbows and kumbaya in the world.
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
There's,
when I
there's
deployed
bad
to-
stuff out there.
When I deployed to Mozambique, we arrived. I was part of an advance party with just 20 of us, but then we landed 1,000 Marines in a field 3 days later after we arrived. When we were there, we built a school and we brought a bunch of dentists and doctors. We were trying to do good things, but the deterrent value there was a local Al Qaeda training cell, which is why we made a show of force when we arrived. We demonstrated to the local military, to the local government, and the local populace that the U.S. can land 1,000 Marines in your backyard overnight. It's not worth joining Al Qaeda. We didn't have to shoot at anybody. We didn't hurt anyone. In fact, while we were there, we did our best to do good for the local infrastructure. But that's the primary role of the U.S. military when we're not in the midst of an active conflict. It is doing work to deter that next conflict, and that's what engineering does.
Cool.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, sorry. As much as I want to keep talking about stuff, we're going to have to wrap on time just to make sure that everyone can get to their flights and everything. But I do want to go quickly and for each of you to kind of plug what you're working on, where people can find you, and then, we'll wrap it up. But, really appreciate you guys coming on, and this has been fun, and this is... I actually hate to cut it off because I just want to keep going, but we're on a time.
We'll have to do a part 2 sometime. But
Exactly.
yeah,
I'd love to, yeah.
Cool.
Really
yeah.
appreciate the invite. So, I mean, I think some of you have probably already found me on Twitter at Dr. Chris Combs.
Oh, yeah, it's a good time.
It is a good time.
I'm pretty easy to find online. You can Google me. We've got a lab website where you can find out the actual serious stuff that we do. We've got plenty of papers that are open access if you want to dive into the technical details.
Which, by the way, respect for that. That's
Also a good time.
From me, that's awesome. And
Thanks.
hugely
I do what I can.
valuable.
Yeah, not every single one of them is, but we actually just had one come out the other day about our wind tunnel that I made sure was open access because I wanted to make sure that everybody had those details if they wanted to understand what we're doing testing wise. And so we do have a Mach 7 wind tunnel facility that we run on campus. We are available to work with people to test if that's something that they're interested in. There is a limit to the number of test facilities we have in the United States, right? And so we wanted this to be a national resource. It is. And so that's another thing on a more technical side. If people want to reach out, if they've got a program where they need to do some testing, let me know. Send me an email. It's easy to find.
Oh, what's your email then so people have it?
Yeah, and so it is ccombs@utsa.edu. Easy to remember.
That is
Boom.
easy. Yeah.
All right.
Don't email me. My name's Alex Hollings. Find my work primarily on Sandboxx News with 2 X's, but you can also find a lot of my work in Popular Mechanics. And I host a weekly show on YouTube called Air Power with Alex Hollings on the Sandboxx channel. And you can find me on TikTok. I am talking aerospace and military aviation on TikTok just about every day. So Alex Hollings 52, I think on there and every other social platform.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. This has been great. And, thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it.